Hi everyone, I want to show you the progress the Node SDK team made in Sprint 4. So we're now able to deploy a chain code, invoke that deployed chain code, and do a query. So the following steps, I'm going to show you how to do this so you can test the SDK with the Fabric. First thing you need to do is to make sure you grab the proper level of the Fabric to do the testing. This is because ever since Sprint 5 opened as of Monday, November the 7th, the Fabric code has further changed and it's not compatible with Sprint 4 any longer. But let me show you how to get to the proper commit level so you can test it out with the Node SDK code. So in your Fabric Git, do a log, and then if you grep for this particular string, fab939, make sure FAB is all capitalized. And now you have the one pointing to the one authored by Jim Zhang. That's me. And that's the level of the commit you want to get to. Okay, so you can do a git checkout, put it into a branch. Let's call it Sprint 4. And then copy the commit string. So now your Fabric code is good. So I'm going to go to Vagrant. You need to make a change in the Vagrant file. In order to map the orderer port from inside Vagrant to outside. This is because all of the Node SDK code can be run in your native host, whether that's Windows or Linux or Mac. So you can run the Node.js test outside of Vagrant, and so you need to map the ports. We're going to use a Docker Compose to start up the network inside Vagrant. And that Docker Compose file, you can find inside fabric-sdk-node repository. And if you go to test fixtures, you can find the Docker Compose. So it's going to start up a member service, an orderer with the solo, and one peer that's connected to that orderer. Okay, so because we just changed the Fabric content, we need to go inside Vagrant and do another build so we can have the Docker images built to that level of the code. So I'm going to do a Vagrant SSH to log into Vagrant. To make images. This will build all the proper Docker images needed for our testing purposes. Okay, it looks like all the Docker images are successfully built. So now we're ready to start it up. I copied the Docker Compose file into a file inside Vagrant. So I'm going to use it to start it up. I'm using the force recreate switch, so everything is started from a clean slate. Okay, so when you see this message committing block to state database, this means the peer has been successfully connected to the orderer. So that's a good sign that the network is ready. Okay, so now back in my in my Mac host, I'm going to run the test case. So inside Fabric SDK, we're going to run the end-to-end test that does the flow that I outlined before, like this. So first, let's take a quick look at the code. So the chain code that we're going to deploy is fairly straightforward. It's based on the chain code example 02 to emulate money transferring between two bank accounts. It's going to have a init method to do the initialization during deploy. It's going to have an invoke method. It used to have a query method, but that's now been removed. In the new design of chain code API, everything for invoking transactions or making queries are all going through a single invoke method. And this method can use parameters to further direct the call to other functions. So in our case, we have a move function to move money from one account to another. We also have a query function to query for balance of a particular account. You can get the details once you download the repository. If you go to text, fixture, source, GitHub example CC, then you can see the details of the code. As far as the application code that's going to drive the new Node SDK API, this is what it looks like. So inside one of our test unit tests end-to-end, we have the code that instantiates a new chain, set the key value store on it, set the member services, set an orderer, and then enroll a member, and then send, and then you can start doing the deploy and invoke and query from that. So the first thing we do is to send a deployment proposal pointing to the peer, which is our endorser. Once that's successfully processed, we get a response for proposal response. We also the API also returns the original proposal for the endorsement inside the response data. That's because this proposal object is needed for constructing the transaction object to send to the orderer. So in the send transaction API, we're passing the response itself plus the original proposal, and then the send transaction API is going to do the necessary processing to prepare the transaction object and send it to the orderer. So if everything goes fine, the chain code will have been deployed at the end of this call. So because the event hub code hasn't been re-enabled on the peer, we don't have event notification at this point yet. So instead, we'll just sleep for 20 seconds, waiting for the transaction to be committed to the ledger. So next step is we're going to call that chain code for a transaction. The first step is still to do a proposal, and this is using a different API called transaction proposal instead of the deployment proposal up here. Once the endorsement comes back, again we get the proposal response and the proposal in the resolved data from the API, and then we send it in to the send transaction API and sleep for another 20 seconds for everything to get committed to the ledger. And finally, we do a query. We call this API query by chain code. So you're passing the chain code ID and the peer you want to call upon to return you the result. So that's all it takes. And as you can see, the new API is promise-based, so you can chain all these calls with the then handlers. All right, so now let's give it a spin. This step is waiting for the peer to take the proposal, spin up a Docker container instance, and process the chain code, collect the result, sign the result in the endorsement with the signature, and then return it back. Once the client gets the response, the code looks like status 200, and then they will forward it on to the orderer inside a transaction object. And after waiting for 20 seconds, it's going to go to the next step of calling that transaction. And then the proposal looks like was successful again, so it then submitted to the orderer, and now wait for 20 seconds again, and finally do a query as the last step, and that validates that now B has 300, so everything looks good. So this is how you can test the Sprint 4 content of the Fabric and Node SDK. If you have any questions, feel free to reach any of us on this list on the Slack channel Fabric SDK Node or Fabric SDK. Again, this is Jim. Thanks for watching.